The adult human vertebral column is composed of 26 bones. In a fetus, there are 33 bones. 9 of these bones actually fuse together as an individual ages. The vertebral column is divided into sections. The first 7 vertebrae are called the cervical vertebrae, as can be seen here. The next 12 vertebrae are called the thoracic, and each one is attached to a rib, as you can see. The remaining or following vertebrae, the next 5, are called the lumbar vertebrae. Then there are the 9 fused vertebrae. 5 of these vertebrae fuse to form the sacrum, here, and the last 4 vertebrae fuse to form the coccyx, here, that are known as your tailbone. The vertebral column is curved. You can see it's an elongated S. The cervical vertebrae curve slightly inward, the thoracic slightly outward, and then the lumbar slightly inward again. The vertebral column has 2 functions. First and foremost, it protects the spinal cord within it. In addition, in between each vertebrae is a small intervertebral disc made of fibrocartilage. This allows the vertebrae to be somewhat flexible. Each one can slightly slide compared to the next, allowing us to rotate our torso and flex our torso. Now let's take a look at these vertebrae in a little bit more detail. The first 7 vertebrae are called cervical. This is an actual cervical vertebrae from a human, and you can see that it has several features very similar to this diagram. Now these features in this vertebrae are similar to the features of both the thoracic and the lumbar vertebrae. And we will look at the similarities and differences as we study them. So to begin, the cervical vertebrae has a major structure here called the body. It's colored in blue. The body of the vertebrae is the place where that intervertebral disc rests between it and the next vertebrae. Lateral to the vertebral body are 2 areas called the transverse processes. These are the transverse processes. I have colored them in a slight purple color for you to see. This is the only vertebrae that has an opening within the transverse processes. This opening is called the transverse foramen. You can see this opening here. The next structure that we're going to look at is called the spinous process. The spinous process has been colored in green and is here. This is actually the portion of your spine that you can feel. If you were to run your fingers along the base of your neck where you can feel kind of a bony projection, this is what you're touching. These are the spinous processes. Notice that the spinous process of the cervical vertebrae has a slight U shape that it has just on the posterior side. Now on either side of the spinous process, where it meets the remainder of the vertebrae, you would find this area that I've shaded in pink. This area is called the lamina. Now between the lamina and the transverse process is a small shaded area of red. From the top it doesn't look very significant, but from the lateral view you can see that this area actually has a slight curve out of it, an indentation. This is where nerves, coming from the spinal cord, which is represented by my probe here, extend outward to meet different areas of the body. This pedicle area is a location for nerves, and there's one on each side. So the spinal cord travels through this opening, and then the nerves extend outward. The opening through which the spinal cord can be found is called the vertebral foramen and is observable right here. Now the last item that I want to look at in this particular vertebrae are these areas that I've shaded in yellow. These are actually smooth surfaces that you can see here, and from the lateral view you can even see that they're slightly projected here and here. These are called the superior articular process. Articulate means to join, superior means above, and process is a part of a bone that sticks up. So these 2 areas are where this vertebrae will actually touch the vertebrae above it. There's also an inferior articular process, but it's not visible from this image. So if I flip it over, the inferior articular process is here and here. And that's where this vertebrae would touch the vertebrae below it. Remember that they are kept apart at all other locations by that intervertebral disc, which was blue in our first model. Now with the cervical vertebrae at the top, let's take a look and compare the cervical vertebrae to a thoracic vertebrae. Here is the thoracic vertebrae. Notice first of all that the spinous process is much longer and it's more pointed. It actually projects posteriorly in the body, downward. Also notice that the transverse processes are more distinct, that the vertebral foramen is getting smaller, and that the body of the vertebrae has a slight heart shape to it. These are very distinguishing factors of a thoracic vertebrae. So again, the spinous process is in green. Here we have the transverse processes. The transverse processes are colored in blue. This area that I've shaded in pink is again the lamina. The area I've shaded in red is the pedicle. Remember, the pedicle from the side is that small archway through which nerves can be found from the spinal cord. We also have the body of the vertebrae here in this light blue color, and the orange X represents the vertebral foramen. Now the thoracic vertebrae, along with its other differences, has two structures that we do not find on any of the other vertebrae, and it has to do with the fact that this is associated with the ribs. So a rib typically curves around and comes to the front of the body. So a rib would curve around and come to the front of the body, as you can see in this model. It curves around and comes to the front. Now because it curves around and comes to the front, it attaches in two places on the thoracic vertebrae. Here, at this spot in gray, this is where the head of the rib attaches. So this is called the demifacet for the head of the rib. Then the rib comes around like this because it's curved, and it meets at this spot I've colored in black. This is where the tubercle of the rib attaches, and so this is called the facet for the tubercle of the rib. Demifacet for the head of the rib, facet for the tubercle of the rib. They can be seen here on this real bone. Here is the demifacet for the head of the rib, and then here would be the facet for the tubercle of the rib. Lastly, like the cervical vertebrae, these yellow areas represent the superior articular process, the projection at which this vertebrae would join the one above it. Now let's compare these two to our last vertebrae. This is a lumbar vertebrae. The lumbar vertebrae, as you can see, is much larger than the other two. The body of the vertebrae is bigger. It's supporting more weight. But the vertebral foramen is getting smaller because the spinal cord is getting smaller as it travels through the rest of the vertebral column. It's losing nerves at each level, therefore there's not much of the spinal cord left. In addition, we can see that the spinous process is thicker and wider and doesn't point posteriorly like it does in the cervical vertebrae. Now let's look at some of the specifics of the lumbar vertebrae. So again, we can point out some of these same structures. Spinous process in green, lamina in pink, superior articular process in yellow here. And from this view, you can actually see a small portion right here of the inferior articular process. And that can be seen in this vertebrae as well. There's the inferior articular process. We can also see the transverse processes in purple. You can see the pedicle in red. You can see the body of the vertebrae in light blue, and the vertebral foramen in orange. Now that you've been able to compare all three types of vertebrae in the human vertebral column, let's take a look at comparing these vertebrae to some vertebrae from some other species. So continue on with applying your knowledge at the bottom of this page.